Let's talk to Dan Hodges, commentator of the Mail on Sunday. Dan, very good morning to you.
Morning.
So, here we are. I mean, I'm calling this one of the worst weeks in history for politics in general. And I'm not even just talking about Keir Starmer. I'm talking about Rishi Sunak. I'm talking about the whole, ridiculousness of the super injunction, the terrible, terrible toll that has taken on certainly my listeners and viewers who have said that this is the final straw. You know, they've lost all faith in government in general. You know, they hate the Tories, they hate Labour, and they want to go to reform.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's fed into what is, the prevailing national mood, and obviously rightly in this instance, it's exposed the utter incompetence of some of the, senior officials and civil servants, and to an extent ministers, who, are responsible for this absolute utter scandal. I mean, I've got to be honest. I mean, and coming from a slightly different perspective to quite a lot of people on this, in that I do actually have some sympathy with those Tory ministers, and indeed Labour ministers who inherited this mess, but those Tory ministers who were presented with this situation where there had been this data breach, which was putting at lives potentially thousands of people who had actually, served Britain whilst we were in Afghanistan. I mean, but I think you touched on the key element of this. I still don't, setting that aside, I still don't understand why what appears to be a blanket decision was taken to, as a result of this data breach, just allow anybody into Britain who claimed to have been assisting Britain in the country. Right. Because, and this may sound harsh, those people who falsely tried to claim they'd been working with the British and as a result, had to get themselves and their families out of the country. Ultimately, the responsibility for what happened and the reason they ended up on that list primarily rests with them.
Yeah.
So I certainly think that ministers and officials should have been much more hard-headed with that section of the list. But I do understand why, in the immediate aftermath of the breach and moving forward, why ministers attempted to keep it secret, because obviously their priority was and just to add, and obviously as we now know, it wasn't just Afghan nationals who were on that list. It was member of the British Security Services, MI6, soldiers, etc.
Yeah, and I get all of those points, and frankly, Ben Wallace probably did the right thing. I mean, a lot of people have been very critical of Ben Wallace, including, of course, Dominic Cummings, who said he was the worst Defence Secretary we've ever had. I'm not sure I take Dominic Cummings at face value on that one, but I think most people understand that when Ben Wallace was confronted with the news that this leak had happened, and he said, "Well, let's get an injunction out and keep it safe for 4 months," and I think that was probably the right thing to do. But it was then the subsequent super injunction that Grant Shapps seemed to have got, who's been out and about this morning apparently saying he would do it again in order to save those lives. I think he's wrong about that, because I think by the time the 4 months had passed, it certainly seems to me to be clear that the Taliban probably had got their hands on the list by then anyway. And so it wasn't any longer about the fact that, lives needed to be safeguarded. It was more about, the Tory government needed to be safeguarded, because they could never have sort of survived that kind of blunder. But I've got this from John Miller, right? This is one of the parents of one of the Red Caps who was killed in Iraq during the Iraq War, if you remember, when six young men were brutally murdered by the Iraqis. He says to me this. He says, "This Afghan debacle is boiling my blood. I recall at a meeting with John Hutton at the Ministry of Defence on the eve of my other son being deployed to Kabul. He was at pains to tell me it was a NATO issue. I argued that there were 28 member countries signed up to NATO for the invasion of Afghanistan. So why was it only the UK and the US that were sending out our sons? My point being, why the hell is the UK taking all of the Afghans and none of the other so-called NATO members?" So that's another issue. We seem to be taking the bulk of all these people coming out of Afghanistan, and yet it was a NATO operation. Why aren't they going elsewhere?
Well, I don't know what the situation is with other, other countries and their Afghans who supported their forces and their administrators whilst they were there. I'd be amazed if other countries weren't taking people. But the key thing is, people are trying to say, was the super injunction put in place for protecting lives or for protecting the reputation of the government? The reality is it was done for both reasons.
Yeah.
There was obviously an element of self-interest. Ministers were obviously aware they were covering something up that would be deeply, deeply embarrassing for them politically. And at that time would potentially have been terminal for the government at the time, as it was. Obviously, the government got booted out anyway. But the key thing is this: in a sense, the fact that some ministers were trying to protect their reputations is a side issue. The key issue is that the priority had to be and has to be going forward, because sadly, this is not the last time we are going to be in Afghanistan. The nature of the world, we are going to be deploying overseas again. And when we do that, we are going to want people to help support and protect and facilitate our armed forces and our administrators. And if Britain gets a reputation as a country which basically throws these people out of the balloon, then we simply won't be able to operate.
No, I get that.
Again.
But again, it's a numbers game, though, Dan, isn't it? I mean, I was in Bosnia briefly, not for very long, but I watched what went on, and you could see that there were some people who were hired as interpreters, and you could see that there were some people who were facilitators. But when the British Army was based in Vitez, which is where I was, there wasn't very many of them. So the idea that we've somehow inherited what could be as many as over 100,000 people from Afghanistan is way out of proportion to the numbers who would have helped the 12,000 British troops who were there. Do you know what I mean?
No, I agree with that, and that's where I think ministers needed to be much more hard-headed. And I think ministers needed to say, look, we will guarantee the safety and security of those who have generally, assisted our forces. Yeah. But we are not simply going to give a blanket commitment to everyone was on that list, because obviously, it was an appalling data breach. But at the end of the day, the people who were on that list, and who had not been assisting our forces, had not been assisting the British authorities. Yeah. Ultimately, it's a very hard thing to say, but I'm going to say it. Ultimately, the responsibility for ending up on that list rests with them. Yeah. And it goes the other way. We have an absolute, in my view, obligation to all those who assisted our forces while we're out there. And you will remember, there was a big campaign actually, and I agreed with that, about how slow it was to bring out those people.
Well, this was why when we were talking about this story earlier in the week, I was saying, the idea that this was all under a super injunction is kind of mad, because I remember having many conversations, maybe I even had some with you, about the speed with which it was happening, and how we were unsure of whether we were getting the right people out. I remember the conversations about whether we should be bringing dogs out rather than people. Yeah. All of that with pen farthing. And there was plenty of conversation around the Afghan resettlement scheme. So why on earth they had to keep it, or pretend to keep it quiet, or keep it stumm away from the British public, it's beyond me.
Well, I think there's two things. Firstly, again, going back to my original point, the other thing people need to realise is, my understanding is, as a result of the efforts, the sudden scramble to try and get out of Afghanistan, everybody that was on the list, a number of people who genuinely should have been brought out because they had been helping our forces, then, as it were, slipped down the hierarchy of people who were being brought out. Right. So that was another problem. On the issue of what they were trying to cover it up, ultimately, and this is where we kind of move over into the Labour government, because I've seen criticism of John Healey and Labour on this, and as you know, I'm not won't hold back in criticising the government, but on this I've got sympathy. It's quite clear that they weren't trying to cover up the fact that people were coming, which is why there was that memo about how do we manage it, how do we manage the narrative, etc. Yeah. What they were trying to cover up was the reason why all these people were suddenly coming out. Now, as I said, I think that decision ultimately was wrong, giving this sort of this blanket commitment. But again, in fairness to ministers, they weren't covering up the numbers of people that were coming. They were covering up the reason they were covering, and obviously the muck-up. And obviously underpinning all this...
I think they were covering all of it up. I disagree with you. I think it was all of it, because what about that memorandum that we now know about that was sent out in September of last year, basically noting that a lot of the places where the rioting took place over the summer after Southport were places where an awful lot of Afghan refugees had been sent?
Well, obviously, that, as I said, you know, there were various components in relation to the decision, and there were various elements in relation to it, and there were various factors floating around. And frankly, given the nature of the scandal and the initial cover-up and the initial muck-up, obviously a factor, you know, how people, these very large numbers of new asylum seekers were going to be integrated into these communities. I mean, we're already seeing, you know, we haven't even come on to that yet. We're already seeing, you know, the issues in areas of the country where asylum seekers are being housed, and the tensions that's creating. Right. So the fact that ministers were cognizant of that and discussing that, I'm not going to criticise them for that, especially given, in fairness to Labour, this was not a blunder of Labour's making. This was something they inherited from the previous government. This is one that does rest squarely on the shoulders of previous Tory government.
Yeah. But I think it's compounded by the way that Labour then handled it, because I think, again, they got it wrong. They could have lifted the injunction earlier. They kept the injunction on, bizarrely, for longer than the Tories did.
I think that's... I agree with that, but I do think, again, knowing how government works, because remember, we're talking about ministers. Obviously, it was officials who ultimately made these blunders. Yeah. And we know how the official machine seeks to protect itself. If you've got officials saying to ministers, "Look, minister, if you don't keep this super injunction in place, we haven't got everyone out yet. We haven't nearly got everybody out we need to get out. I'm just saying to you, minister, if you lift the super injunction, it can place those lives at risk, and there's no guarantee the Taliban aren't going to march down their street in a week's time, kill them, and drag them out in front of the cameras, and that's going to be on you." If you're a minister presented with that, I can understand why you're going to, you know, if you're presented with lives are at stake, ultimately you're always going to err in that way. Now, did they get it right in this instance? No, I think objectively, and the judge was very clear ultimately that they hadn't. But I can understand why they got into the way they were, the process that led to this. But the whole thing, I mean, the real question is, how has no one lost their job?
Exactly.
In fact, how is nobody in jail? Not in jail. Yeah. I mean, these are vital.
Well, somebody pointed out to me,
secrets.
Nick Leeson, right, cost the economy or the company that he was working for, Barings Bank, 817 million quid. He did 4 years in prison. And was called a rogue trader. The idea that this guy has pressed a button that's cost the country or the company of the UK PLC 8 billion quid. I mean, in anybody's game, you know, this guy should be at least fired, if not prosecuted.
Yeah, and also what processes were in place? How was such sensitive information? How is it possible to distribute such sensitive information just at the click of a button?
Yeah,
I mean, this is
it shouldn't be possible. It's incredible. It's a bit like you and I, you know, having, say, I don't know, sort of secret company documents in our sort of personal email, and by accident sending them to a load of our friends. And you go, well, you know, that shouldn't happen.
Anyone watching this program who works for any organisation, it doesn't matter why, inadvertently distributed, you know, huge amounts of sensitive data on their customers, you know, on their customers' private information, they'd be sacked instantly. No, there wouldn't be any ambiguity about it.
No question. But, you know, this is politics. This is the world we live in. Dan, great to see you. Thank you very much indeed. Dan Hodges there, a commentator for the Mail on Sunday.